The deal was simple. 1 year, 12 months of photographs, public appearances, and pretending. Cleo needed the money to save her brother's future. Ryan needed his reputation back. Their agent had it all planned out. What he hadn't planned on was them actually meaning it. The night had fallen like a velvet curtain over the city, but for Cleo, the darkness was suffocating rather than comforting. She stood in the half-empty gallery of her mother's legacy, the dust of unpaid bills and forgotten promises settling on every canvas and sculpture. The private clinic's letter lay open on the mahogany table, a cold ultimatum staring at her. Pay her mother's debts or lose everything. The weight of inheritance, of mistakes she had never made, pressed against her chest like iron. It wasn't just about the walls of the gallery. It was the thought of her younger brother, whose tuition and medical care depended entirely on the thin thread of her success. She couldn't let him become another casualty of their mother's chaotic choices. Every frame she touched was a reminder of the life her mother had left tangled in obligations. She had thought restoration would bring her solace, a quiet rhythm of work and creation, but now it was only deadlines and the threat of financial ruin. Across town, the stadium lights of the football field blinked as if mocking him. Ryan's hands shook slightly as he read the latest tabloid screaming his name across the front page. Accused, scandalized, vilified. The nightclub incident wasn't just a rumor. It was a calculated smear designed to destroy the millions in contracts he had built with sweat and sacrifice. His agent, Marcus, stood nearby, leaning casually against the leather chair, masking calculation with a smirk. "There's a way out," Marcus said smoothly. "You play the perfect family man for a year, and all this disappears. Your image, your career, everything intact. There's a girl involved. Her debts? Cleared. All of it." Ryan's jaw tightened. The offer was absurd, the arrangement cold, transactional, but in his gut, he knew Marcus had orchestrated the chaos to corner him. Yet, as he looked at the contract details Marcus slid across the table, the logic was undeniable. Compliance equals survival. Ryan had trusted Marcus for a decade, granting him full power of attorney and unfettered access to his private security during his rise to fame, a blind spot that had now become his greatest vulnerability. Cleo's first reaction to the proposal had been indignation. She was not a pawn, she was not an actor in someone else's game. But the numbers burned brighter than her pride, illuminating a stark truth. Without accepting, her gallery, her life's work, would vanish. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, a chilling mixture of threat and promise. 1 year. No mistakes. You'll survive, or you'll fall. Ryan, on the other hand, faced his own internal battle. Pride and defiance warred with desperation and pragmatism. He hated the idea of pretending, of wearing a mask for 12 months. But every time he imagined the alternative, the contracts lost, the reputation shredded, the career imploding, he felt the icy grip of inevitability. The deal was struck at sunrise, not with excitement, but with the muted resignation of two people cornered by circumstance. A handshake, signatures, an unspoken agreement that their lives were now entwined by ink, obligation, and necessity. Neither smiled, neither pretended. They parted that morning with a cold professionalism, aware that every day henceforth would be a performance, a calculated dance choreographed by contracts, cameras, and public scrutiny. Cleo returned to her gallery, the sunlight spilling across the canvases, but it offered no warmth. Each brushstroke, each repaired sculpture, reminded her of the price of survival. The first task was simple yet humiliating. Share stage smiles, pose for photos, attend events where the world would see them as something they were not. The humiliation stung, but beneath it, a faint ember of curiosity began to glow. Who was the man behind the headlines? Could the person in those glossy photographs possibly be real? Ryan, meanwhile, studied Cleo from afar, skeptical, defensive, convinced that her motives were shallow, transactional. He cataloged every glance, every measured word, every polite smile, constructing a mental dossier, cautious, meticulous, wary. He had faced opponents on the field, adversaries who tried to outthink him, to manipulate him, but this was different. Cleo was not a rival in sport. She was a human unknown, unpredictable in ways contracts could not define. By nightfall, both returned to the reality of their forced partnership. Cleo unpacked the letters and documents Marcus had demanded she review, her fingers trembling slightly with exhaustion and anxiety. Ryan's phone buzzed with calls from sponsors and team executives, each one a reminder that the world was watching, judging, waiting for him to falter. And yet, somewhere in the silent space between obligations, a fragile curiosity began to take root in both of them. They were prisoners of circumstance, bound by ink and expectation. But within those bindings, the possibility of something uncalculated, something real, flickered. The city slept around them, indifferent, unaware that in two small apartments and half-empty galleries, two people stood at the precipice of lives that would change forever. And as the night deepened, the first spark of tension, resentment, and unspoken questions settled between them, an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing hour. Survival had united them. The question now was whether their forced proximity could awaken something neither had expected. The following week began with a tension that seemed to thrum in the very air around Cleo. The contract, now signed, was not just a piece of paper. It was a cage, a set of invisible chains dictating her every action, every glance, every breath. She arrived at the luxury apartment Ryan had rented, a space designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. Polished wood gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, the faint scent of cologne lingering in corners where sunlight could not reach. Each room whispered of wealth, of power, of the life she could touch but never truly claim. Cleo set down her bag, carefully avoiding disturbing the display of designer furniture, her fingers brushing over the surface of the table, noting the cold perfection of its grain. She felt like a trespasser, a visitor in a world that was not hers, and the weight of obligation pressed down harder than any debt notice ever had. Ryan arrived minutes later, his presence as commanding and restrained as ever. He stepped over the threshold with precise caution, the echo of his shoes on the marble floor punctuating every thought in Cleo's mind. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. The unspoken tension between them communicated volumes. Ryan's eyes scanned the apartment, noting the meticulous arrangement of brushes, paints, and documents Cleo had brought. He noticed how carefully she treated each canvas, her hands steady, deliberate, reverent almost. For a fleeting moment, admiration flickered behind his normally guarded eyes, but it was quickly suppressed by the professional mask he wore so well. She was, after all, here by necessity, not by choice. Every interaction would be measured, every gesture calculated, every glance scrutinized. Resentment simmered quietly beneath every smile, every nod, every careful laugh. Cleo hated the performance, hated the way her autonomy had been leased to save her life. Ryan hated it too, though he buried the frustration under layers of professionalism and public decorum. After the gala, once the last camera shutter had clicked and the world's eyes had shifted elsewhere, silence fell over the apartment. The oppressive weight of the public performance lifted, replaced by a quieter, more personal awareness of each other. Ryan lingered near a sculpture Cleo had been restoring, his fingers brushing over the surface, noting the finesse and dedication in her work. "It's meticulous," he said quietly, not as a compliment, but as an observation. Cleo felt a flicker of something she had not expected, acknowledgement without judgment, interest without calculation. She nodded, a simple motion, but her mind raced. She had expected disdain, indifference, perhaps even condescension. Instead, she found attention, quiet and unassuming. Over the next few days, their routine solidified into a delicate, tension-filled rhythm. Mornings were spent in calculated coexistence, afternoons in orchestrated public appearances, evenings in shared spaces that neither truly claimed as their own. Cleo worked on her restorations, her hands steady despite the gnawing anxiety of being constantly observed. Ryan trained, met with sponsors, answered calls from executives, and yet, in stolen moments, he would observe her. The focus, the precision, the passion she brought to her work intrigued him. It was not the performance of the contract, not the mask of necessity, but something raw, something unguarded. And in turn, Cleo saw him differently. The careful posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way he occasionally winced when stretching or lifting. She recognized the body of an athlete, yes, but also the weight of someone carrying fear, expectation, and history. Marcus, ever vigilant, began to escalate his surveillance. He installed high-end, discreet security cameras throughout the apartment, justifying them as protection against paparazzi, but in reality, he was documenting every unguarded look between Cleo and Ryan to use as leverage if they ever dared to defy him. Yet, despite his manipulations, the natural curiosity, the silent fascination, and the reluctant respect between the two began to grow. Neither acknowledged it, both wary of admitting to themselves that the other was no longer just an obligation. By the end of the week, both understood a simple, undeniable truth. The contract dictated actions, appearances, and words, but it could not dictate perception, feeling, or subtle acknowledgement. In the silent spaces between obligations, a fragile, almost imperceptible connection began to take form. They were prisoners of circumstance, bound by ink and expectation, yet within those bindings, an unpredictable, uncalculated, undeniable spark began to flicker. Each glance, each gesture, each unguarded moment was a seed, tiny and fragile, of something neither had anticipated and both would soon be forced to confront. The city outside carried on, oblivious, while within the walls of the apartment and the galleries, two lives intertwined by necessity began to ripple with the first signs of something deeper. Survival had brought them together. The inevitable question now loomed quietly in the spaces between them. What would happen when obligation collided with authenticity, when performance collided with reality? And neither could answer yet, not aloud, not even to themselves, for the consequences of such acknowledgement could be catastrophic. The first informal dinner at home was a study in awkward proximity. Cleo focused on the rhythm of the kitchen, the familiar weight of the knife providing a grounding contrast to the artificiality of their public life. He, in turn, ate silently, eyes occasionally flicking to her hands, noting the delicate precision in how she chopped vegetables, the way she arranged the plates with an almost obsessive symmetry. Neither spoke more than necessary. Every word had weight, every pause carried meaning. And yet, beneath the surface tension, subtle observations began to weave a new understanding. Ryan saw dedication, a quiet intensity that fascinated him. Cleo glimpsed vulnerability behind the public mask, a man disciplined but not immune to fatigue, fear, or self-doubt. Later that evening, the quiet hours became a crucible for small, unplanned moments. Cleo lingered over a partially restored painting, her brush tracing lines with care. Ryan, unable to resist curiosity, leaned in, his shadow falling across the canvas. "You're precise," he said softly, not as critique, but as acknowledgement. Cleo looked up, startled, her defensive posture relaxing just slightly. "I have to be," she replied evenly. The words were neutral, but the tone carried something heavier, perhaps pride, perhaps defiance, perhaps a subtle invitation for recognition. For the first time, their interaction was not dictated by contract, cameras, or Marcus's expectations. It was organic, fragile, and unexpected. In these private spaces, the first cracks in their emotional armor began to appear. Ryan noticed the quiet intensity of her work, the way she poured herself into the details as if the restoration itself was a lifeline. Cleo, in turn, observed the careful restraint in his movements, the way he bore the weight of public scrutiny, yet still maintained a thread of humanity beneath the celebrity persona. Both were learning to read the subtle cues, the unspoken signals, the honest moments buried beneath layers of obligation and performance. Yet Marcus, ever vigilant, sensed the shift immediately. Small reminders arrived in the form of texts and calls, strategically timed to reinforce the boundaries of their professional arrangement. Cleo was reminded of her temporary status, the impermanence of her contract, and the potential consequences of emotional entanglement. Ryan received quiet insinuations, subtle suggestions that Cleo was performing, manipulating, and incapable of genuine connection. The pressure tightened like a noose, a constant background threat to any genuine understanding between them. Despite Marcus's interventions, the natural pull between them grew stronger. They began to anticipate each other's movements, share small, unspoken acknowledgments, a glance here, a tilt of the head there, a quiet sigh shared in the solitude of their shared space. The contract dictated proximity but could not dictate the awareness, the curiosity, the faint stirrings of empathy. In these moments, they were not Cleo and Ryan under obligation. They were two humans learning to navigate unexpected intimacy, a dance of observation, understanding, and reluctant respect. By the end of the week, the apartment, once sterile and formal, felt different. The spaces were no longer just rooms to occupy. They were arenas of connection, however tentative, and unacknowledged. Every shared meal, every quiet moment over restoration or training, every glance across the table or brushstroke on a canvas became a thread weaving them together. Neither admitted it aloud, yet both felt the subtle tension of change. The contract remained, the obligations were still enforced, the world still watched, but within the walls of that apartment, the first spark of real connection had ignited. Cleo lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's interactions. Each small moment of genuine observation, each fleeting recognition of shared humanity, pulled at her defenses, forcing questions she was not ready to answer. Ryan, in his own space, wrestled with similar thoughts. He had faced countless challenges on the field, survived scrutiny, scandal, and expectation, yet the unpredictability of Cleo's presence unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. That night, instead of just wrestling with thoughts, Ryan began his own silent investigation. He started cross-referencing the timeline of the nightclub incident with Marcus's private logs, his athlete's instinct telling him that the defense his agent provided felt more like a trap. For both, the first real challenge was internal, acknowledging that the contract bound them legally, but not emotionally, and that the growing awareness of each other's humanity could be more dangerous than any public scandal or financial obligation. As the city outside slept, unaware of the subtle storms brewing in two private apartments, Cleo and Ryan continued their forced cohabitation, each day a test of endurance, observation, and control. The first cracks in disdain had appeared, the first sparks of curiosity ignited, and the unspoken acknowledgement of the other's complexity began to weave an invisible thread between them. Survival had brought them together, obligation had cemented the proximity, but reality, messy, unpredictable, unavoidable, was beginning to assert itself. And neither could predict where that reality would lead, only that it had begun its slow, inexorable pull towards something neither contract nor contract-bound pretense could restrain. Marcus watched from a distance, his eyes like hawks tracking the smallest shifts in behavior, the tiniest hints of emotion that could unravel months of careful control. He had orchestrated every step of Ryan's public life, managed every image, every word, every encounter. But arrogance had started to cloud his judgment. He felt so untouchable that he began to ignore the strict legal boundaries of the surveillance tech he deployed, convinced that neither Ryan nor Cleo had the resources or the spine to ever audit his methods. He had moved from being a protector to a jailer, and in his haste to tighten the noose, he grew sloppy, leaving a digital trail of unauthorized access that he assumed would remain buried under the weight of his own reputation. But now, despite contracts, cameras, and rules, something unplanned was happening. The subtle connection forming between Ryan and Cleo was a threat to his carefully constructed order. It was dangerous. It could destabilize everything he had built: Ryan's career, his authority, his control. In his office, Marcus leaned back in his chair, reviewing security footage and reports from staff who monitored the apartment. He noted the way Ryan lingered a fraction of a second too long near Cleo's work, the way she responded with quiet acknowledgement rather than the cool detachment Marcus expected. He gritted his teeth. This was exactly what he had feared: emotions. If Ryan allowed genuine feelings to grow, he would no longer be predictable, no longer manageable. Marcus had built a system where every contingency was accounted for, every public perception molded. He would not allow this one variable, this small, fragile connection, to compromise the entire operation. Marcus began to interfere subtly at first, using tactics honed over years of manipulation. He reminded Cleo, in casual, almost offhand messages, that her role was temporary, that she was only ever part of a contract, and that any emotional attachment was a liability. "Remember your place," one text read, neutral in tone but loaded with implication. To Ryan, Marcus sent carefully timed reminders, hints that Cleo was performing, that she was a professional opportunist, someone who could not be trusted with genuine intimacy. The messages were indirect but potent, designed to plant doubt, to reinforce control without alerting them to overt interference. Inside the apartment, the subtle tension began to rise. Cleo noticed Marcus's influence almost immediately. Every message, every phone call, every hint carried the invisible weight of control. She fought to resist, to maintain her autonomy, but the reminders gnawed at the edges of her confidence. Ryan, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the subtle implications with the observations he had made of Cleo. He had seen her dedication, her integrity, her quiet humanity. Yet Marcus's suggestions seeded doubt, the idea that she was calculating, that she was playing him as part of the arrangement. The result was a growing, silent war of perception and suspicion. Despite the manipulation, moments of genuine connection continued to surface. Cleo would laugh at a small joke Ryan made, a sound unguarded and real. Ryan would offer help, not out of obligation, but because he noticed something she had missed or a gesture that needed attention. These moments, small and fleeting, became battlegrounds between their genuine instincts and the external pressures Marcus applied. Each glance, each touch, each acknowledgement was a subtle rebellion against the constraints imposed on them, both by contract and by the ever-present hand of Marcus. By midweek, Marcus escalated his interference. He began to schedule surprise check-ins, unannounced meetings, and strategically timed phone calls designed to interrupt their moments of privacy. He injected tension into shared meals, forced participation in public appearances, and subtly criticized their private interactions, framing them as errors in judgment, breaches of the contract, or unprofessional behavior. The apartment, once a fragile space for quiet observation and tentative connection, became a pressure cooker. Every choice, every interaction was weighed against the unseen expectations imposed from outside. Yet, paradoxically, these intrusions also brought Ryan and Cleo closer. The pressure forced them to communicate in subtle, unspoken ways. A glance across the room, a shared sigh, a quiet nod became mechanisms to maintain sanity in an environment designed to control them. They learned to navigate Marcus's manipulations, to anticipate his interferences, and to rely on the small signals of trust that could survive even under scrutiny. In their shared moments of defiance, no matter how tiny, they found affirmation that they were not entirely bound by external forces. By the end of the week, Marcus understood that his interventions, while effective in increasing tension, were not eliminating the emotional thread forming between the two. If anything, the subtle, dangerous connection had intensified, coiling tighter under the pressure. Cleo and Ryan were learning not just to tolerate each other, but to observe, understand, and even appreciate the nuances of their shared existence. Marcus's control was formidable, but it could not fully suppress the slow, inevitable emergence of something unplanned, something neither contract nor manipulation could completely contain. As night fell over the city, the apartment, though tense and controlled, carried the faint but unmistakable undercurrent of change. Marcus had inserted himself as the invisible arbiter, the manipulator, the gatekeeper of every potential misstep. And yet, in the quiet corners of shared spaces, moments of authenticity continued to emerge, small sparks defying the meticulous rules he had constructed. The question looming in the shadows was no longer just about survival, image, or obligation. It was whether human connection, once kindled, could resist even the most calculated attempts at control. The first real crisis arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it struck with the force of inevitability. Marcus had discovered a vulnerability, something buried in Cleo's past that he could exploit. It was a minor professional mistake, something she had thought long forgotten, easily explainable in private, yet potentially devastating if revealed publicly. He had also found a tenuous connection to her brother, a detail that could be manipulated to create fear, uncertainty, and leverage. The combination was perfect, a tool to tighten control, and Marcus wielded it without hesitation. Cleo first realized the gravity of the situation in the form of a letter, precise and cold, delivered to her apartment with Marcus's signature efficiency. The letter outlined consequences, subtle yet unmistakable. sign an additional agreement relinquishing any future claims, maintain absolute discretion, and comply with the contract without deviation, or face exposure, ruin, and financial devastation. Every word was carefully constructed to leave no ambiguity. The fine print, the legal phrasing, the unyielding tone, all combined to make escape impossible. Marcus had her cornered, and the weight of obligation pressed down on her like iron chains. The effect on Cleo was immediate and profound. She felt a cold isolation, a tightening of trust that had only begun to form with Ryan. The contract had always been a cage, but now it felt like a prison. She could not speak, could not explain, could not defend herself without risking everything she had fought to protect. The fear was not just for herself. It was for the fragile bond that had begun to grow between her and Ryan, a bond she now had to suppress. Each interaction became a careful negotiation between maintaining appearances and concealing vulnerability. Every smile, every nod, every shared glance had to be calculated, neutralized, or redirected. Ryan, unaware of the specifics of Marcus's manipulation, began to notice a shift. Cleo was more distant, her laughter rarer, her glances fleeting. She moved with a careful, almost mechanical precision, responding only when necessary, withdrawing immediately afterward. The warmth he had begun to sense, the subtle signs of connection that had emerged over shared moments, was replaced by cool professionalism. Confusion set in. He could feel her pulling away, but he had no context, no explanation, only the gnawing suspicion that something was wrong. His mind raced, trying to piece together the change, struggling against the invisible walls that had suddenly arisen between them. The tension escalated during a quiet evening at home. Cleo prepared tea with mechanical efficiency, her hands steady but her posture rigid. Ryan attempted conversation, tentative, searching for connection, for understanding, for a clue that might bridge the sudden gap. "You've been distant," he said finally, the words carefully neutral, yet carrying the weight of concern. Cleo paused, hand frozen mid-pour, and forced a polite smile. "I'm just tired," she said softly, words true in the simplest sense but carefully chosen to reveal nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken complexities neither could address. Marcus had succeeded in isolation, creating a wedge between them that was invisible to the world but palpable in the shared space. As days passed, Ryan's frustration grew. His trust, once tentative but building, began to fray under the weight of unexplained distance. He had faced scandal, manipulation, and public pressure before, but this was different. Cleo had always been the one variable he could not control, the presence that defied predictability, and now she seemed to withdraw completely. The gap between observation and understanding widened, and his instincts, honed by years of competition and scrutiny, screamed that something critical was being hidden from him. Cleo, meanwhile, wrestled with the impossible. Every interaction with Ryan was a test of restraint, every gesture of warmth suppressed, every glance of vulnerability denied. The additional agreement Marcus had forced her to sign loomed over her mind, a legal and emotional constraint designed to break trust before it could solidify. She longed to explain, to reach out, to bridge the growing gap, but the NDA's threat was absolute, and the consequences for defiance were severe. Every decision was a careful balance between self-preservation and the fear of losing the fragile bond she had begun to recognize as real. By the end of the week, the apartment had transformed from a space of tentative exploration into a battlefield of restraint and unspoken tension. Ryan observed, waited, questioned silently, and misinterpreted small gestures. Cleo acted, concealed, endured, and calculated. The external manipulator, Marcus, remained unseen yet omnipresent, guiding their behavior with subtle nudges and invisible threats. The first real fracture had appeared, the emotional equilibrium disrupted, and the challenge became clear. Could trust survive when constrained by fear, obligation, and manipulation? As night fell, both sat in separate corners of the apartment, aware of each other but bound by silence. The distance was palpable, the tension a living, breathing presence. Survival had kept them together. The contract had enforced proximity. But now, the human element, the unpredictable, fragile, and essential connection, was at risk. Marcus had not merely interfered. He had shifted the entire dynamic, creating doubt, fear, and isolation. And neither Cleo nor Ryan knew that this first crisis, the deliberate wedge driven by Marcus, was only the beginning of challenges that would test loyalty, courage, and the resilience of nascent feelings neither could fully acknowledge. The charity gala arrived like a storm, polished and controlled on the surface, yet brimming with the potential for disaster beneath the glittering exterior. The grand hall shimmered with crystal chandeliers, mirrored walls reflecting 1,000 glances, and the soft murmur of socialites discussing art, charity, and influence. Cleo moved through the space with grace, her posture perfect, her smile calibrated, but inside, attention coiled tightly. She knew this event would test more than appearances. It would test trust, courage, and the fragile emotional bond forming between her and Ryan. Ryan, in his tailored tuxedo, navigated the throng of well-wishers, photographers, and sponsors with practiced poise. Yet beneath the calm surface, a storm of anxiety churned. Marcus's warnings, the distant threat of exposure, the persistent shadow of manipulation, all lingered like smoke. But tonight, the stakes were different. Cleo would be there not as an obligation, but as someone whose presence mattered, whose influence, however subtle, could shape the course of the evening. And in Ryan's heart, something stirred, a recognition that his feelings were no longer bound by contract or obligation, that Cleo had become something real, vital, and unavoidable. The first sign of crisis appeared quietly. A journalist, sharp-eyed and relentless, approached with a pointed question, hinting at the scandal Marcus had orchestrated months before. The subtle insinuation was enough to unsettle Ryan, to draw a flicker of unease across his expression. Cleo, noticing the danger, acted instinctively. She stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Ryan and the reporter, her eyes steady, her voice calm but firm. "That matter is irrelevant to tonight's purpose," she said, deflecting the insinuation with precision and authority. The room paused, the tension palpable, yet the message was clear. She was protecting him, not out of obligation, but out of care, from a place of genuine concern. The rest of the evening became a crucible of shared understanding and silent communication. They moved through the gala as a unit, their interactions no longer mechanical or contractual. Every glance, every subtle touch, every shared smile carried weight, meaning, and unspoken recognition. The cameras captured only the surface, the world believing in a polished, orchestrated partnership, but beneath the image, something far more real was taking root. Ryan noticed the small sacrifices Cleo made to protect him, the quiet courage in her actions, and he felt an emotion he had not anticipated, gratitude evolving into admiration, admiration into something deeper. Later, in a quieter corner of the hall, away from the spotlight, the unspoken truth surfaced. Ryan's voice, low and careful, broke the silence. "Why did you do that? Step in for me, like that?" Cleo's response was measured, yet her eyes betrayed her sincerity. "Because it mattered. Because I care." The words were simple, but the honesty behind them shattered the barrier of pretense that had governed their interactions for months. For the first time, there was no contract, no obligation, no manipulation, only truth, raw and undeniable. In that moment, the weight of months of tension, obligation, and unspoken emotion culminated in a single, fragile understanding. They had both crossed a threshold. The carefully maintained boundaries, the walls of self-protection, had begun to crumble. Ryan reached out, hesitating only briefly, and took her hand, a gesture of trust and recognition, grounding them both amidst the chaos of the gala. Cleo, feeling the sincerity, the weight, and the danger of the moment, allowed herself to lean slightly into the contact, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown despite every obstacle. The night ended not with a dramatic confession to the world, but with something more personal, more intimate. They found a secluded terrace, the city lights shimmering below, the hum of distant traffic a soft background to the storm of emotions between them. No cameras, no contracts, no interferences. Only two people finally seeing each other fully, without pretense, without fear, and without obligation. The first genuine exchange of feelings, raw and unfiltered, took place in silence, punctuated by shared glances and subtle gestures. By the end of the evening, a delicate transformation had occurred. The contract still existed, Marcus's manipulations still loomed, but a new, unpredictable variable had emerged: authentic emotion. Ryan and Cleo, for the first time, acknowledged internally what they could not yet speak aloud fully: the beginnings of trust, the stirrings of attraction, and the undeniable truth that their connection had moved beyond obligation. The foundation for future challenges, conflicts, and revelations had been laid, grounded not in performance or calculation, but in human authenticity and courage. The revelation came like a thunderclap. Marcus, always calculating, had anticipated the moment of emotional vulnerability and struck with precision. Within hours of the gala, the press received an anonymous tip, meticulously framed, highlighting the details of the original contract: the so-called fake marriage, the staged appearances, and Cleo's supposed manipulation for financial gain. Headlines exploded overnight, a firestorm of accusation and speculation that left no room for nuance. Ryan awoke to calls, messages, and the relentless ping of notifications. Sponsors demanded statements, fans debated online, and the media frenzy escalated into a tidal wave of scrutiny. Cleo felt the blow immediately, even from a distance. She knew Marcus had orchestrated this, knew he had played every angle to regain control, but the speed and intensity of the fallout were staggering. Ryan's career, built on talent and reputation, was now endangered not by scandalous truth, but by the carefully constructed perception of betrayal. The agency, the sponsors, the public, they all believed the narrative Marcus had fed them. The truth of Cleo's protection at the gala, her genuine concern, her unspoken feelings, was invisible behind the curtain of orchestrated evidence. Ryan's world tilted. The clarity of the feelings he had begun to acknowledge for Cleo clashed violently with the manufactured narrative Marcus had unleashed. Confusion, anger, and betrayal collided in a storm of emotion. He confronted Cleo, not with questions about her intentions, but with the weight of doubt imposed by Marcus's manipulation. "Did you ever care?" he asked, his voice raw, trembling with the tension of uncertainty. Cleo, restrained by the NDA and aware of the broader consequences, could not reveal the truth. Every instinct screamed to defend herself, to explain, to unburden the secret she carried. But the law, Marcus's threats, and the stakes prevented any honesty. She could only meet his gaze, her expression a mixture of pain, frustration, and silent pleading. The days that followed were suffocating. Ryan withdrew emotionally, his trust shaken to its core. He observed Cleo with suspicion, misreading hesitation as deceit, restraint as calculation. Every small gesture became suspect, every glance analyzed for hidden meaning. Cleo, meanwhile, endured the weight of accusation silently, her own heart aching at the inability to defend herself, to reveal the manipulation behind the public chaos. The contract, which had once felt like a cage, now felt like chains reinforced by public perception and legal threat. Marcus had not only manipulated the narrative, but had created an environment in which emotional honesty was impossible, ensuring his dominance remained unchallenged. The apartment, once a private refuge, became a minefield. Every interaction carried the potential for misinterpretation. The simple act of sharing a meal, a glance, or a gesture was fraught with tension. Cleo moved carefully, every motion calculated to avoid provoking Ryan's suspicion. Ryan, in turn, observed, analyzed, and reacted with increasing restraint, unsure of where genuine emotion ended and manipulation began. Marcus's influence was pervasive, invisible yet suffocating, and the emotional bond that had begun to grow between them was under siege from all sides. And yet, in the silence of their separate spaces, small signs of resistance persisted. Cleo's eyes lingered briefly on Ryan when he was not looking, a flicker of concern and connection she could not suppress entirely. Ryan, despite the storm of doubt, found himself noticing small details, the quiet courage behind her composure, the integrity that had first drawn him to her. The manipulation, though powerful, could not erase the foundation of authenticity that had been established through shared moments of trust and observation. Marcus, observing from a distance, was pleased, at least for now. The seeds of chaos had taken root. Ryan doubted, Cleo suffered in silence, and the perception of betrayal had spread like wildfire. But the subtle, undeniable human connection he could not control remained, a dangerous variable that, if nurtured, could undermine his carefully laid plans. And Marcus knew it. The next phase of his strategy would require even greater subtlety, a combination of pressure, deception, and timing designed to break the bond completely before it could mature into a threat to his authority. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within. Headlines screamed betrayal, gossip swirled in social circles, and the world watched Ryan and Cleo through the distorted lens of manipulation. The question was no longer whether they could maintain appearances, but whether they could survive the psychological and emotional assault imposed by a master manipulator. And in the quiet moments, when the city slept and the cameras were off, both Ryan and Cleo felt the weight of truth, the pull of authentic emotion, and the looming challenge of resisting the forces aligned against them. Small interactions became tests of endurance. Ryan noticed the faintest hesitation in her movements, misinterpreted it as deceit. Cleo detected the subtle coolness in his eyes, a reflection of his suspicion, and responded with measured neutrality. Shared meals, once opportunities for silent connection, became exercises in restraint. The apartment's walls, which had previously harbored the beginnings of trust, now echoed with unspoken doubt and frustration. Each moment together was a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and concealing the truth. The first confrontation came quietly, but with devastating effect. Ryan, overwhelmed by a swirl of media pressure, contractual obligations, and manipulated perceptions, confronted Cleo in the living room, his voice tense and questioning. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, the words heavy with frustration and hurt. Cleo met his gaze, her own expression a careful mask of composure, hiding the turmoil inside. "I can't explain," she said quietly, each word deliberate, constrained by the NDA and the unyielding grip of Marcus's manipulation. The silence that followed was palpable, a chasm of mistrust that neither could bridge. The emotional separation intensified as days passed. Ryan retreated into himself, attempting to navigate the chaos of public scrutiny while wrestling with the private doubt that gnawed at his confidence. Cleo, trapped by obligation and fear, withdrew further, her actions guided by the twin imperatives of survival and discretion. The bond that had begun to form, delicate and tentative, frayed under the pressure of unseen forces and imposed suspicion. Their shared space, once a site of observation and connection, became a landscape of caution, distance, and unspoken pain. The distance was mirrored in every aspect of their interactions. Casual glances became rare, shared gestures were minimized, and conversation was reduced to necessity. The emotional intimacy that had begun to emerge was now obscured by fear, doubt, and the weight of imposed secrecy. Marcus's manipulations had achieved their immediate goal, creating a wedge of mistrust, isolating Cleo, and destabilizing the connection between them. Yet beneath the surface, both Ryan and Cleo retained an unspoken awareness that the bond, though strained, was not entirely broken. As the city slept beyond the windows, the apartment was heavy with tension. The atmosphere was charged, a quiet storm of emotion constrained by circumstance and manipulation. Ryan and Cleo moved like cautious participants in a delicate dance, their proximity enforced by the contract yet emotionally distant, each step measured, each gesture calculated. Marcus, satisfied for the moment, observed from the shadows, confident that his strategy had fractured the connection and secured his control. And yet, the human element remained, resilient and undeniable. Despite distance, doubt, and the weight of secrecy, both felt the lingering pull of connection, a thread of recognition that refused to be severed completely. The first major fracture had occurred. Trust had been tested and strained to the breaking point. The challenge that lay ahead was whether that connection could survive further trials, whether honesty, courage, and authenticity could prevail against the relentless tide of manipulation and public scrutiny. The stakes were higher than ever, and the path forward uncertain, but the seed of potential reconciliation still existed, fragile yet persistent beneath the surface of mistrust. Cleo had spent sleepless nights poring over documents, emails, and legal clauses, searching for a way to protect herself and Ryan from the unrelenting manipulation of Marcus. She knew the NDA was a cage, an unbreakable chain in theory, but somewhere in the tangle of contracts, loopholes, and procedural details, there had to be a weakness. Her fingers traced lines of fine print, her eyes scanning for any phrasing that Marcus might have overlooked, any legal technicality that could give them leverage. And then, almost imperceptibly, she found it. A procedural oversight, evidence that Marcus had conducted surveillance beyond the bounds of legal authority, collected information unlawfully, and inserted it into his manipulative strategy. The discovery was a quiet explosion in her mind. This was the key, the means to circumvent the NDA without violating its terms. It was fragile, requiring precision, courage, and timing, but it was real. She could expose Marcus's misconduct, reveal his orchestration of the initial nightclub scandal, and shift the narrative entirely. For the first time since the crisis began, she felt the surge of possibility, a pathway to reclaim agency for herself and to defend Ryan. The risk was immense, but the potential reward, the chance to reveal the truth, to restore trust, to reclaim control, was worth it. Cleo moved carefully, preparing her evidence, documenting every detail, and consulting trusted legal counsel to ensure every step was airtight. She gathered proof of illegal surveillance, emails that exposed Marcus's manipulation, and records showing that the first scandal had been orchestrated, not accidental. Each document was a piece of a larger puzzle, a weapon against the manipulator who had nearly destroyed their trust and autonomy. The process required patience, meticulous attention to detail, and an unwavering resolve, but Cleo had no alternative. When the moment came to present the evidence, it was calculated with precision. Ryan, still constrained by doubt but desperate for clarity, was included in the strategy. Cleo explained the situation, presenting the legal findings, the documentation, and the evidence of Marcus's deception. She revealed, step by step, how every crisis, every wedge of mistrust, every threat had been manufactured. Ryan's eyes widened, disbelief giving way to comprehension, and then to relief. The fog of manipulation lifted, and he finally saw the truth. Cleo had never betrayed him, had never acted out of self-interest, and had been constrained by threats and legal barriers beyond her control. The revelation was a turning point. Ryan, understanding the full scope of Marcus's deceit, felt the surge of trust and connection that had been suppressed for weeks. The emotional chasm between them began to close, repaired not by words alone, but by the undeniable evidence of truth, the removal of doubt, and the recognition of Cleo's courage and integrity. Before they could move forward, they sat in the heavy silence of the living room, stripping away the months of performance. They spoke of the fear that had dictated their silence and the bitterness that had clouded their judgment, finally acknowledging that the real betrayal wasn't the contract itself, but the way they had allowed Marcus to define who they were to each other. Only after that raw, painful honesty did their shared moments begin to carry the weight of true authenticity. Marcus, confronted with the evidence, could not deny the extent of his misconduct. Legal action was immediate, unambiguous, and overwhelming. He faced exposure, professional ruin, and accountability for the orchestrated crises that had threatened both Cleo and Ryan. The tide of public opinion shifted as the truth became known, revealing the manipulation that had fueled scandal, doubt, and emotional distance. Ryan's reputation, though tested, began a careful recovery, bolstered by the public understanding of the deceit he had endured. In the quiet aftermath, Cleo and Ryan shared a moment free from pretense, contracts, or manipulation. The weight of past deception was replaced by clarity, trust, and mutual recognition. They were no longer bound by obligation or fear, but connected through shared resilience and honesty. The journey had been perilous, the stakes monumental, yet the outcome affirmed a profound truth. Authenticity and courage could overcome even the most calculated schemes of manipulation. The stage was set for a new beginning. The manipulator had been revealed, the lies exposed, and the bond between Cleo and Ryan strengthened by adversity. Their connection, once tentative and constrained, was now fortified by the knowledge of truth, the triumph over deceit, and the recognition of their own resilience. The path forward was no longer defined by contracts or threats, but by choice, trust, and the unbreakable foundation of genuine human connection. The morning after the courtroom victory was quiet, almost surreal. Ryan sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, illuminating the evidence of their ordeal. Papers neatly stacked, phones silenced, and a lingering tension that had been replaced by calm. Cleo moved beside him, preparing coffee with the steady hands of someone who had endured too much yet emerged stronger. There was no grand celebration, no dramatic proclamation to the world, only the quiet recognition that they had survived, together, and that the manipulator who had threatened their trust and lives had been removed from the equation. Ryan reached across the table, taking Cleo's hand gently. "We did it," he said, his voice low, filled with relief and gratitude. Cleo looked up, her expression soft, exhausted but unburdened. "We did," she echoed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in months, the weight of contracts, threats, and public perception was gone. The room was filled with the subtle relief of authenticity, the kind that comes from surviving a storm, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The court had ruled decisively. Marcus was held accountable for his manipulations, illegal surveillance, and orchestrated crises. Ryan's career, while shaken, began a careful reconstruction. Sponsors and fans, now aware of the deceit, returned cautiously, their confidence restored by the undeniable truth. Cleo's financial situation, no longer tied to manipulated obligations or coercion, began to stabilize. The contracts that had once bound them were nullified, severed not by legal loopholes alone, but by the triumph of truth, resilience, and courage. More importantly, their bond, tested, strained, and nearly broken, emerged stronger. Trust, once fragile, had been rebuilt on the foundation of shared struggle and revealed authenticity. The gestures that had once been constrained by obligation became spontaneous. The glances once measured became honest. The conversations once guarded became open. For Ryan and Cleo, the path forward was no longer defined by external pressures or manipulative forces, but by choice, mutual respect, and the willingness to be vulnerable with one another. There was no idealized wedding, no orchestrated moment for the public eye. Instead, there was a quiet agreement, an understanding that the next chapter would be defined not by performance or contracts, but by reality. They could walk forward together, not bound by obligation or expectation, but by trust, love, and the shared experience that had forged an unbreakable connection. They chose to keep their relationship private for a while, not because a contract demanded it, but because for the first time, they had something that didn't belong to the public, the sponsors, or the cameras. It was theirs alone. Every decision, every step, would be theirs alone, free from manipulation, free from coercion, and grounded in the knowledge that they had survived everything the world and Marcus had thrown at them. In the following weeks, they moved into a new apartment, a space chosen together, reflecting neither obligation nor performance, but the authenticity of their renewed partnership. Ryan, freed from Marcus's shadow, focused on his career and personal growth, knowing that his integrity was intact. Cleo, liberated from fear and coercion, embraced her work and passion, her confidence restored, her spirit unbroken. The city outside continued in its chaotic rhythm, indifferent to their victories and losses, yet within their walls, there was peace, understanding, and the quiet joy of being seen and accepted for who they truly were. The final moment of the story was simple, almost understated. Ryan, standing on the small balcony of their new apartment, watched Cleo arrange a small canvas by the window, her fingers deft and precise. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and Cleo looked up, meeting his gaze with an unspoken acknowledgement of all they had endured and overcome. There was no need for words. The trust, the love, the shared history, and the promise of a future built together without contracts or manipulation spoke louder than any declaration. And so, the story closed not with a fantasy of perfection, but with the realism of survival, choice, and authentic connection. They had faced catastrophe, deception, manipulation, and public scrutiny. They had endured betrayal, doubt, and separation. Yet through it all, they had emerged whole, capable of love grounded in trust, respect, and the courage to start anew.